My family didn't invite me for a fancy dinner, but expected me to set up, then leave before it started. I never thought I'd be the one left out of my own family's celebration, but that's exactly what happened. They planned a fancy dinner, dressed up, raised their glasses, and never once thought to invite me. Not as a guest, not as family, just as their unpaid help. But this time, I decided to do something they never saw coming. You won't believe how they reacted when I finally put myself first. Stay with me, because this story is about to take a shocking turn. The evening sun filtered through my apartment window, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. I sat at my kitchen table, absent-mindedly swirling the remnants of my coffee in its mug. My phone buzzed against the countertop, the name flashing across the screen, sending a familiar, sinking feeling through my chest. Mom. I let it ring for a moment, staring at it, already knowing exactly how this conversation was going to go. I could predict every word, every inflection in her voice, every polite demand disguised as a favor. Finally, with a deep breath, I picked up. Maddie. Hi, sweetheart. How are you? Her voice was warm, cheerful, but I knew better than to believe this was just a social call. I could practically hear the undercurrent of expectation beneath her words. I'm good, Mom, I said cautiously. What's up? Oh, well, you know how hard Ethan has been working? His promotion came through. We're throwing a big dinner party for him on Friday night. His boss, his colleagues, some close family friends. It's going to be wonderful. He deserves to be celebrated, don't you think? There it was, the setup. The pretense of sharing news before she got to the real reason she called. I leaned back in my chair, gripping my mug a little tighter. That's great. Tell him congratulations from me. Oh, I will, she said quickly. And listen, I was hoping you could come a little early. Help with the decorations, set up the tables, arrange the food. You always make everything look so perfect. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. Of course, I wasn't being invited to celebrate. I was being enlisted to work. Again. So, do you want me to bring anything? I asked, knowing full well the answer. A small pause. Then, oh no, sweetheart, we've got everything covered. It's just, well, you know how these things go. You have such an eye for detail, and it would be a huge help if you could just come by around 4 to get everything looking just right before the guests arrive. 4. Before the guests arrive? Before the celebration actually started. Before I had a chance to be anything other than the person making sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my grip tightening. So, I'm not actually invited to the dinner? Another pause, just a fraction of a second too long. Oh, sweetheart, it's not like that. It's just Ethan's colleagues will be there, his boss. It's really more of a professional gathering, you know? You wouldn't really fit in with that crowd. There it was. The final blow wrapped in a thin veil of politeness. My brother, the golden child, the center of every event, every conversation, every ounce of my parents' pride. And me? I wasn't a guest. I wasn't family. I was staff. I see, I said, keeping my voice even. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of hearing the sting in my words. Oh, don't be like that, Maddie, she sighed. You know how much we appreciate you. You've always been so helpful, so dependable. We just really need you there to make sure everything is perfect. You understand, don't you? Did I? Did I understand? I thought back to every family event, every holiday, every milestone celebration where I had been the one setting up, coordinating, making sure things went off without a hitch. Every time Ethan had been celebrated while I blended into the background, barely acknowledged. Every time I had been expected to drop everything, rearrange my life because they needed me. And then, as if the universe was trying to send me a message, my phone buzzed with a notification. A restaurant reservation app. A suggestion for a table for one at La Belle, Friday at 7:30 p.m. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen. I had always wanted to try that place. Always thought about going, but never had an excuse. Or rather, I had never let myself have an excuse. My mother's voice brought me back. "Oh, and if you could pick up some extra napkins on the way, that would be perfect." I think we might run out. Napkins. That was what I was to them. Someone who remembered the napkins. Someone who made sure the silverware was perfectly aligned. The glasses were spotless. The food was plated just right. I took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly, steadying my voice. "Sure, Mom. Oh, thank you, sweetheart. You're such a lifesaver." And just like that, the conversation was over. She hung up before I could say anything else. No goodbye, no see you soon. Just the unspoken expectation that, as always, I would be there. But not this time. I stared at my phone, at the blinking cursor on the reservation screen. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, telling me that this was selfish, that family came first, that Ethan deserved this night. But did I? Did I deserve anything? I hesitated for only a second before tapping the screen. Reservation confirmed. Friday, 7:30 p.m. Party of 1. I set my phone down, a strange sense of exhilaration washing over me. For once, they could figure it out without me. The days leading up to Friday passed in a blur, but something inside me had already shifted. I went through my routine, went to work, answered emails, ran errands, but all the while, I kept coming back to that single moment, the confirmation on my phone screen. Reservation confirmed. Friday, 7:30 p.m. Party of 1. It felt like a small act, almost insignificant. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how monumental it actually was. For once, I wasn't rearranging my life for them. For once, I had made a decision solely for me. And it was terrifying. By Thursday night, the text messages had started rolling in. "Don't forget to pick up extra napkins. Can you bring those decorative tea lights we used for Thanksgiving? Remember to be here by 4 p.m. sharp. We can't afford any last-minute stress." Not a single one asking if I was coming, just assumptions, expectations. Like always, I stared at my phone, watching as another message popped up, this time from my dad. "Hey kiddo, looking forward to seeing you tomorrow." Short, simple, no demands, no expectations, but even that wasn't enough to make me change my mind. Friday morning, I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation. A lingering nervous energy settled in my stomach as I sipped my coffee by the window, watching the city stir to life below me. I knew what today was. I knew what I was about to do. And still, part of me hesitated. I had spent years filling a role, being the one who smoothed things over, the one who made things easier. And now, I was walking away from that. My mother was going to be furious. Ethan wouldn't care beyond how it affected his night. And my dad, well, he'd probably just go along with whatever my mom said, like he always did. I knew they would call. I knew they would text. But I had made up my mind. At exactly 10:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Mom." I let it ring. Then again at 11, 15.11, 45.12, 20. By 1 p.m., I had 6 missed calls and a flurry of texts. The later ones weren't as patient. "Maddie, where are you? We need you here. Tell me you're at least on your way." This is getting ridiculous. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my fingers gripping the cool edge of the marble. My heart was pounding harder than I wanted to admit. This was it. This was the moment. The moment where I decided, once and for all, that I wasn't going to let them dictate my life anymore. I exhaled, shaking my head. Then, without giving myself time to overthink it, I turned off my phone. The silence was immediate, heavy, but freeing. I spent the afternoon in quiet defiance, moving through my apartment with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I took my time getting ready, savoring each step as if I were preparing for something much bigger than just a dinner reservation. I curled my hair, let it fall in soft waves over my shoulders, chose a dress I had been saving for someday, slipped on my favorite heels, and as I stood in front of the mirror, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't rushing to meet anyone else's expectations. I wasn't dressing up for someone else's approval. This moment, this night, it was mine. At exactly 4:00 p.m., while my mother was undoubtedly pacing around the house in full-blown panic, I was stepping into my shower, letting the warm water wash away the years of obligation I had carried on my shoulders. By 6:30, I was ready. By 7:00, I was walking out of my apartment, my purse slung over my shoulder, my phone still turned off. And by 7:30, I was sliding into my seat at La Belle, a soft candle flickering in front of me, the hum of conversation filling the air like a quiet melody. The restaurant was beautiful, warm, inviting. The scent of slow roasted herbs and fresh bread filled the space, wrapping around me like a comfort I hadn't known I needed. I took a slow sip of wine, letting the moment settle, letting the knowledge of what I had done, what I hadn't done, sink in. Back at my parents' house, I could only imagine the chaos. My mother frantically trying to salvage the evening, my father attempting to placate her, Ethan rolling his eyes and pretending not to care. I could almost hear the sharp edge in my mother's voice as she snapped orders, scrambling to fill in the gaps I had always filled. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't there to fix it. My phone sat untouched in my purse, vibrating intermittently with the flood of messages I was sure were piling up, but I didn't reach for it, didn't even think about it. I took another sip of wine, set my glass down, and smiled to myself. For the first time ever, they were going to have to figure it out without me. At this point, I had two choices: give in like I always had, or finally make them see what life without me looked like. So I made a decision that changed everything. But here's the real question. When they realized I wasn't coming, did they regret it? Or did they just blame me like they always do? What do you think? Drop a 1 if you think they finally saw my worth, or a 2 if you think they stayed the same. Let's see how this unfolds. The first sip of wine was smooth, rich, settling on my tongue like a quiet victory. I let it linger, rolling the taste over my palate as I glanced around the softly lit restaurant. La Belle was just as elegant as I had imagined, small, intimate, the kind of place where conversations felt weightier under the dim glow of candlelight. The waitstaff moved effortlessly between tables, balancing trays of delicate appetizers and bottles of aged wine. Across the room, a couple leaned in close, laughing over something private, their hands brushing over the table in a way that spoke of familiarity. I watched them for a moment, feeling an odd sense of detachment, like I had stepped into someone else's life for the evening. And in a way, I had. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the stem of my glass. My phone sat silent in my purse, still turned off. I had no idea how many missed calls or texts had piled up in the last hour, and honestly, I didn't care. I had spent my entire life being available, always answering, always showing up, always bending to fit whatever space my family needed me to fill. But tonight, I wasn't playing that role. Tonight, I was invisible to them. The thought sent a thrill through me. Somewhere, miles away, my mother was pacing. I could see it in my mind, the sharp click of her heels against the tile floor, the tense set of her jaw as she checked her watch for the 10th time. The guests would be arriving soon, and nothing was ready the way she had envisioned. No perfectly set table, no strategically placed appetizers, no polished presentation to impress Ethan's colleagues, and no Maddie to clean up the mess. For the first time, they were dealing with it alone, and I wished I could be there not to help, but to watch. I imagined my father, always the peacemaker, attempting to soothe my mother's rising frustration. She probably just lost track of time, he'd say, though he wouldn't sound convinced. My mother would scoff, her fingers tightening around her phone as she fired off another text, one that would never be answered. And then there was Ethan. Ethan, who had never lifted a finger for anything that wasn't directly tied to his own success, who had always assumed things would be handled because they always were. I wondered when he'd finally realize I wasn't coming, when it would dawn on him that for the first time his night wouldn't be seamless. that for once I wasn't there to make him look good. A waiter approached, setting down a small plate of warm, crusty bread with a dish of herbed butter. "Would you like to see the menu, ma'am?" I smiled, nodding. "Yes, thank you." He handed it to me, stepping back just as my phone vibrated against the fabric of my purse. Even through the layers, the sound felt intrusive, like a tiny crack trying to form in the piece I had built for myself. I ignored it. Instead, I ran my fingers along the edge of the menu, my gaze flicking over the selections. I took my time, savoring the power of choosing something for me. Somewhere in another part of the city, my mother was realizing she had lost control. And there was something deeply, profoundly satisfying about that. Back at my parents' house, the tension was reaching a breaking point. The candles hadn't been lit. The appetizers hadn't been plated. The table wasn't set with its usual precision. The guests were due to arrive in less than 15 minutes, and nothing was the way it should be. And that's when my mother snapped. "She's not answering," she seethed, her fingers gripping her phone so tightly it looked like she might crack the screen. "Maybe she's stuck in traffic," my father offered weakly, though they both knew better. My mother's jaw clenched. She wouldn't do this, but I had. Ethan, standing lazily by the kitchen counter, took a sip of his drink, completely unbothered. "So what? We don't need her." My mother turned on him so fast he nearly stepped back. "Oh, really? You think your precious dinner party is going to run itself?" She waved an arm toward the disorganized dining table, the trays of untouched food, the general state of disarray. "Look around, Ethan. Who do you think usually makes this happen?" Ethan rolled his eyes, but something in his expression shifted. Maybe for the first time, he was starting to understand. Meanwhile, I was ordering dinner. I smiled up at the waiter, handing back the menu. "I'll have the short rib with the truffle risotto." "Excellent choice." He nodded, disappearing back into the kitchen. I settled back in my seat, running a finger along the rim of my wine glass, picturing the scene unfolding without me. The frantic energy, the desperate attempt to salvage what should have been effortless. My mother, realizing too late that she had built her entire evening on the foundation of someone else's labor, someone who had finally walked away. I wondered what that moment felt like for her. Did she feel betrayed? Or did she finally understand what she had done? The first guest arrived at 7:00 sharp, stepping into a house that no longer functioned as a well-oiled machine. The illusion had cracked. The carefully curated performance of the perfect family had fallen apart. And I was nowhere to be found. The second glass of wine felt even better than the first. It went down smooth, warming me from the inside out as I let my body sink further into the plush seat. The restaurant was alive with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the soft strumming of a jazz guitarist in the corner. It was the kind of place meant for celebrations, for stolen moments of indulgence. And yet, here I was alone. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just okay with that. I was reveling in it. I twirled the stem of my glass between my fingers, staring at the dark red swirl of wine, my mind flickering to what was happening back at my parents' house. The guests would be arriving now, stepping into a scene that was less than perfect. I could picture it, the forced smiles, the rushed attempts to make things seem polished, the underlying tension as my mother scrambled to cover up the cracks. Because there were cracks, big ones, the kind that weren't supposed to exist in our family. And tonight, those cracks weren't being smoothed over with my quiet labor, with my ability to make chaos invisible. I imagined my mother standing stiffly by the entryway, her practiced hostess smile faltering at the edges as she greeted the first guests. "Welcome. So glad you could make it," she'd say, but her eyes would flick anxiously toward the dining room, toward the missing touches. She hadn't had time to correct. The centerpiece wouldn't be quite right. The silverware might be off by a fraction. The appetizers, God, the appetizers. I wondered if they even made it out of the fridge. Ethan, of course, would be unbothered. He'd flash his usual charming grin, shake hands, bask in the attention, because his night would still be his night. Except for one tiny detail, the effortless perfection that always existed around him wasn't there anymore. And that would gnaw at him, even if he didn't want to admit it. The thought sent a quiet thrill through me. For the first time, they were feeling my absence in a way they had never felt it before. I took another sip of wine, savoring the way it settled in my chest, before finally, I pulled my phone out of my purse. I didn't turn it on right away. I just looked at it, resting there in my palm, dark and silent. A barrier between me and whatever storm was raging on the other end. How many messages were waiting? How many missed calls? I pictured my mother's frantic attempts, the slow unraveling of her patience as she realized I wasn't playing along this time. With a deep breath, I powered the phone back on. The screen lit up instantly. 23 missed calls, 14 voicemails, dozens of unread texts. I exhaled, my fingers hovering over the notifications before I finally scrolled through them. Mom, Maddie, where are you? I told you we needed you here at 4. This isn't funny. Mom, the guests are arriving soon. You're being completely unreasonable. Mom, Maddie, answer your phone. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is incredibly selfish. Dad, Maddie, just call your mother, please. Ethan, wow. Really? You're actually doing this? I smirked at Ethan's message. It had that signature condescension, the disbelief that I could possibly defy expectations, that I could step out of my assigned role. Yes, Ethan, I wanted to text back. I'm actually doing this. I kept scrolling. The messages from my mother grew shorter, sharper. Maddie, answer me. Right now. Then, if you leave now, you can still get here before dinner starts. Then, finally, fine. Do whatever you want. And just like that, I saw it. The moment she broke, the moment she realized I wasn't coming, a slow smile tugged at my lips. I set my phone down, unread messages still lighting up the screen, and turned my attention back to my dinner. The waiter returned, setting down my plate with a quiet enjoy. And, oh, I planned to. Back at my parents' house, the unraveling continued. By now, my mother would be trying to salvage things in that tight, controlled way of hers, throwing herself into hostess mode, smoothing over the obvious gaps. My father, ever the quiet bystander, would be keeping his head down, sipping his drink, avoiding the inevitable explosion. And Ethan? He'd be fuming in the way only Ethan could annoy, but not enough to actually do anything. I pictured them all, circling around each other, their worlds slightly off-kilter in my absence. I wondered if they even understood why it felt different, if they had truly grasped that it wasn't just about tonight, but about every single night before this one, all the times I had made their lives easier without them even noticing. Did they feel it now? I hoped they did, because I was done being invisible. I was done fixing things. And as I took another bite of my perfectly cooked short rib, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Satisfaction. The first bite of my meal was absolute perfection. The short ribs were slow braised, tender enough to melt on my tongue, coated in a rich, savory sauce that had been reduced to its deepest flavors. I let out a quiet sigh, savoring the warmth that spread through me. This was the kind of dinner I'd spent years arranging for other people, carefully plating appetizers, ensuring the wine pairings were just right, adjusting lighting to create the perfect ambiance. But tonight, for once, it was mine. And God, did it taste better because of it. I sipped my wine, letting the deep red swirl against the glass as I glanced around the restaurant. The hum of conversation, the occasional bursts of laughter, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off polished silverware. It was a scene I had set 100 times before, but I'd never really been in it. Not like this. Not as a guest. Not as someone who actually mattered in the space she occupied. A vibration against the table snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at my phone, still face down. Another text. Another attempt to drag me back into a role I'd finally stepped out of. I let it buzz. I didn't need to look. I already knew the messages were growing more desperate, more frantic. My mother's carefully curated evening was unraveling, and she had no idea how to stop it. I imagined her pacing near the kitchen, phone clutched in her perfectly manicured fingers, frustration turning into something dangerously close to panic. Because this wasn't just about tonight. This wasn't about some napkins or a centerpiece, or whether the place settings were flawless. It was about control, and she was losing it. I picked up my fork again, cutting into another bite, resisting the pull of old habits, the temptation to check, to reassure, to fix. Because that was who I had always been, the fixer, the problem solver, the one who made things work even when no one noticed. But not tonight. Tonight, they were on their own. Back at my parents' house, I could picture it all too well, the guests beginning to settle, conversations floating over half-empty wine glasses, the realization sinking in that things weren't quite right. Maybe they wouldn't be able to put their finger on it at first. Maybe they'd just sense that something was off. The way my mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The way my father was quieter than usual. The way Ethan's usual arrogance seemed forced this time. Then someone would comment, "Diane, I have to say, I'm surprised. Your dinners are always so impeccably put together. This one feels different." There, that's the moment it would hit her. The moment she'd feel the sting of imperfection, the embarrassment of failing to live up to her own impossible standards. Because I wasn't there to make it seamless. I wondered how she'd react. Would she deflect? Would she make excuses? Would she even acknowledge that the missing piece of her puzzle had always been me? I smiled, taking another sip of wine. For the first time, they were feeling what it was like to not have me there. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. The weight of my absence was pressing in on them in a way they'd never experienced before. And it was glorious. My phone buzzed again. I inhaled slowly, then against my better judgment, I turned it over. A single new message from my father. "Dad, we should have invited you." I stared at it. Not a demand, not a guilt trip, not a plea for me to show up at the last minute and save the day. Just 6 simple words. Words that carried the weight of something I hadn't expected. Acknowledgement. I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. Was it real? Did he mean it? Or was it just an attempt to smooth things over, to lure me back into a cycle that I was desperately trying to escape? I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment settle over me, letting him sit in it too, letting all of them feel it. Because for once, I wasn't rushing to make things easier. For once, I wasn't fixing it. And if that made them uncomfortable, good. The wine in my glass had gone warm, but I didn't care. I wasn't drinking it for the taste anymore. I was drinking it for the moment, for the quiet defiance of sitting in this restaurant, alone, choosing myself over them. The soft murmur of conversation around me felt like a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. A couple laughed at a nearby table, their voices melting into the soft instrumental music playing overhead. A waiter breezed by, refilling someone's glass with effortless grace. And then there was me, sitting here, existing in a space I had never allowed myself to occupy before. And yet, despite the peace I had fought for, the damn phone buzzed again. I ignored it. I'd ignored every message, every missed call for the past 2 hours, but some part of me could feel the desperation growing on the other end. The weight of my absence was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a problem. And I knew exactly how my mother handled problems. Control. I glanced at the screen against my better judgment. Mom. No message this time, just another call. I let it ring, and then another, and another. I exhaled sharply, setting my glass down a little too hard against the table, the soft clink sounding louder than I expected. The temptation to answer, to confront whatever chaos was happening back home, gnawed at me. But I knew better. God, I knew better. I had spent years being pulled into their crises, years dropping everything to smooth things over, years allowing them to believe that my existence was synonymous with my usefulness. But not tonight. I reached for my purse, shoving my phone inside, silencing the vibration against the leather. Whatever was happening, they could deal with it. And yet, my mind wouldn't let go. I pictured my mother standing in the middle of the dining room, her perfectly styled hair slightly out of place, her expression tight as she glanced toward the clock. She was supposed to be here by now. The appetizers had probably been hastily thrown together by my father, the table slightly off-center, the napkins definitely not folded the way she liked them. Guests would have noticed by now, the flaw in the evening. And it wasn't just about the missing details, it was about what that absence meant. Because without me there, the cracks in their perfect image weren't just small, they were glaring. My mother was unraveling, and I knew exactly what came next. I didn't need to see her messages to know how this was playing out. I had seen it before countless times, but I had never been on this side of it. Right now, she was standing in front of my father, her voice just a little too high-pitched, her gestures just a little too sharp. This wouldn't be happening if Maddie were here. A comment said loud enough for Ethan to hear, for anyone within earshot to absorb, planting the seed, letting it grow. She's being unreasonable, selfish, dramatic, because that's how it always went. I wasn't just absent, I was hurting them by not being there. I wasn't just taking a night for myself, I was punishing them. In her mind, my refusal to drop everything and show up wasn't an act of independence. It was an attack, and that's when she would shift. The moment she realized I wasn't coming, the moment she felt it, she would change tactics. Pity. I don't understand why she's doing this to me. All I've ever done is try to include her. Maybe I should just stop trying. And God, that one always worked. That one had always pulled me back. Because deep down, no matter how much I fought it, some part of me still wanted to believe that she cared, that it wasn't just about control, that I mattered to her in a way that wasn't transactional. But tonight, I wasn't falling for it. Tonight, she could say whatever she wanted. I wasn't there to hear it. I took another sip of wine, letting the warmth settle in my chest, allowing myself to breathe. Because for the first time, I had taken something that was never given to me, a choice. And back at my parents' house, they were finally learning what it felt like to not have one. The night air was crisp as I stepped out of the restaurant, the glow of the city stretching out in front of me like an open road, full of possibility. For the first time in years, I had done something for myself without asking permission, without explaining, without feeling guilty. The weight on my shoulders, the invisible burden I had carried for as long as I could remember, felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. But as I walked down the quiet street, the satisfaction I had felt moments ago was tainted by the gnawing sensation in my gut. The knowledge that right now, across the city, my family was imploding. And for once, I wasn't there to stop it. I could see it happening in my mind. The dining room, usually a picture of effortless elegance, was likely in disarray. The appetizers hastily thrown onto platters, the silverware not perfectly aligned, the floral centerpiece just slightly off-center, the tension in the air so thick it could suffocate. My mother's face tight, her carefully constructed mask of poise beginning to crack. She was probably pacing now, her heels clicking against the floor, her voice sharp as she tried to salvage the evening. My father, quiet as always, torn between keeping the peace and acknowledging the undeniable truth that things were falling apart without me. And Ethan? Oh, I could hear his dismissive scoff, the way he would roll his eyes, acting as though none of this affected him, while secretly enjoying the chaos. And then the moment, the inevitable breaking point, the moment my mother would snap. She had likely been holding it together all night, biting back her frustration, forcing smiles for guests who probably sensed something was off. But as soon as the last person walked out that door, the gloves would come off, and I wasn't there to absorb the blow. I could almost hear it. This never would have happened if Maddie had just done what she was supposed to do. a glass slamming onto the counter. The sound of my father sighing, rubbing his temples, the weight of years of avoidance settling onto his shoulders. Ethan's half-hearted shrug, his way of disengaging, acting as if none of it mattered. And then, the real blow. She's always been selfish. Always. We give, and she just takes. That one would have stung. Years ago, I would have taken those words like a blade to the heart, let them dig into my ribs and fester. But not tonight, because for the first time I wasn't there to hear it. And the most terrifying part for them? I wasn't coming back. I reached into my purse, fingers hovering over my phone. The rational part of me screamed to leave it alone, to let them sit in the consequences of their actions. But another part, one I hated, one I had spent years trying to silence, wanted to know. Had they even realized what they had done? I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and turned the phone back on. The screen flooded with notifications, 23 missed calls, 52 unread messages. I swallowed, my heart hammering against my ribs as I scrolled. The messages told a story, a descent into chaos. Mom, Maddie, this isn't funny. Where are you? Mom, the guests are here, and everything is a disaster. I hope you're happy. Mom, how could you do this to us? Then, a shift. Dad, I know we've made mistakes, but please, talk to me. And then, the most shocking one. Ethan, holy sh*t. Mom is losing it. If you're reading this, honestly, I don't even blame you. I blinked. Ethan. The one person I had been convinced would never get it. The golden child, the one who had spent years reaping the benefits of my sacrifices without so much as a second thought. And now, even he saw it. Something in my chest tightened. I scrolled further, past the frantic messages, past the guilt-tripping, past the anger, until I reached the last one, sent just minutes ago. Dad, we should have invited you. I let out a slow breath, my grip tightening around the phone. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a grand, sweeping moment of redemption, but it was something, and for the first time, it was their turn to wait. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my phone still glowing in the dim interior. The weight of my father's message lingered in my chest, pressing against the carefully built walls. I had spent years constructing. We should have invited you. It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was the closest thing I had ever gotten. I could picture him sitting at the kitchen table, his fingers tapping absently against the wood, his brows furrowed as he tried to piece together where everything had gone wrong. And my mother? She was probably pacing the length of the dining room, wine glass in hand, her face tight with frustration, with disbelief that I had actually done it, that I had left them to deal with their mess alone. A sharp gust of wind rattled against the car windows, breaking me from my thoughts. The restaurant's soft glow faded into the distance as I drove through the quiet streets, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead of me. I should have felt at peace, triumphant even, but my mind was still tangled in the chaos I had left behind. My absence wasn't just noticed, it had shaken them. For once, they weren't talking around me, assuming I'd pick up the pieces. They were talking about me, realizing the cracks in the foundation they had built. As I pulled up to my apartment, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. It was mine. There was no one waiting inside, no mess to clean up, no orders to follow, just me. The thought sent a strange kind of thrill through my chest. I climbed out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin as I made my way up the stairs, my phone still buzzing in my pocket. More messages. I ignored them. I had waited years for them to notice me, to see me as more than just a convenient solution to their problems. They could wait a little longer. Inside, I kicked off my heels, the warmth of my apartment wrapping around me like a safety net. I poured myself a glass of wine, savoring the rich taste as I settled onto the couch, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The weight of the evening started to fade, replaced by something new, relief, freedom. And then the phone rang. I stared at the screen, my mother's name flashing across it like a beacon. I could ignore it. I should ignore it. But against my better judgment, I picked up. The silence on the other end stretched for a beat too long before she finally spoke. Maddie. Her voice was tight, clipped, the way it always was when she was trying to keep control. I don't understand what's gotten into you. I let out a humorless laugh, swirling my wine. What's gotten into me? Mom, I finally said no. That's it. You didn't just say no, she snapped. You abandoned your family. There it was. The guilt trip. The manipulation. The carefully chosen words designed to make me feel like the villain. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. No, Mom. I didn't abandon you. I just chose myself for once. A sharp inhale. This family has always relied on you. You know that. Yes, I do. My voice was steady, but inside, my pulse was hammering. And that's the problem. A beat of silence. I needed you tonight, she finally said, her voice quieter this time. I counted on you. No, I corrected. You expected me. You didn't ask me. You didn't invite me. You just assumed I'd be there, like always. She scoffed, the sound sharp and bitter. This is about Ethan, isn't it? You've always been jealous. I sat up, my grip tightening around my phone. This has nothing to do with Ethan. This is about you treating me like I'm useful instead of treating me like I'm family. Another silence. This one longer, heavier. I don't understand, she whispered. And that was the worst part, wasn't it? She didn't understand. She had spent so many years fitting me into this tiny, convenient box that she couldn't comprehend the idea that I had stepped out of it. I exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of my nose. Mom, I love you, but I can't keep being the only one holding everything together. If you can't see that, then I don't know what else to say. A breath, a hesitation. And then, the softest, most fragile, I didn't mean to make you feel like that. For a second, I almost softened. Almost let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of change. But then she sighed, and the moment shattered. I just don't understand why you had to do this tonight of all nights. I closed my eyes. There it was, the real truth. She didn't understand. Not really. Not yet. Good night, Mom, I murmured, hanging up before she could say anything else. The moment the call ended, I felt it, the shift. The invisible tether that had always bound me to them, to their expectations, to their assumptions. It was fraying, breaking, and I was finally letting it go. I woke up to a quiet morning, the kind of silence that felt peaceful rather than heavy. The sun streamed through my bedroom window, casting soft golden light across the sheets. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up with a mental checklist of things to do for someone else. There was no rush to get dressed, no frantic messages to answer, no last-minute favors to squeeze into an already packed day. It was just me, my coffee, and the unfamiliar but liberating realization that I had finally set a boundary. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed on the counter. I hesitated before picking it up. My mother's name flashed on the screen, but instead of the long, accusatory messages I had expected, it was a simple text. Mom, we need to talk. Please. I exhaled slowly, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Last night's conversation still echoed in my mind, the disbelief in her voice, the way she had struggled to grasp the idea that I wasn't at her beck and call anymore. Part of me wanted to ignore her, let them sit with the consequences of their actions a little longer. But another part of me, the part that still wanted something from this family, knew I couldn't avoid this forever. I typed back 2 words. Me, fine, coffee? Her response was almost immediate. Mom, no, come to the house. A bitter smile tugged at my lips. Of course, it had to be on their terms. But this time, I had a choice. And I wasn't walking in there as the daughter who fixed everything. I was walking in as someone who had finally learned to say no. I took my time getting ready, slipping into a comfortable sweater and jeans, my movements unhurried. By the time I pulled up to my parents' house, it was already mid-morning. The place looked the same pristine, carefully curated, the way my mother always kept it. But there was something different about it today. Something off. I knocked twice before pushing the door open. My mother was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. My father stood by the counter, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Ethan wasn't there. Maybe he had decided this conversation wasn't worth his time. Or maybe, for once, he had enough sense to stay out of it. Mom looked up when she saw me, and for the first time in my life, she actually looked hesitant. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." I did. Silence stretched between us for a long moment, thick and heavy. Then, finally, she spoke. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I don't even know where to start." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by the honesty. An apology would be a good place. She sighed, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Maddie, you have to understand. I never meant to make you feel unimportant. I just never thought." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I never thought you minded." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "That's the problem, Mom. You never thought about it at all." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but for once, she didn't argue. She just nodded. Dad cleared his throat. "You were right," he said, his voice steady. "We should have invited you. We should have included you. And we shouldn't have expected you to handle everything like it was your job." I studied him for a moment. My father was never one to admit when he was wrong. The fact that he was sitting here actually saying these things meant something. Mom exhaled slowly. "I can't change the past, but I can try to do better." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But years of being overlooked, of being the one who sacrificed while Ethan got the praise, it wasn't something that could be erased with a single conversation. "Doing better means treating me like your daughter, not your unpaid event planner," I said. My voice firm. "It means inviting me to things because you want me there, not just because you need someone to set the table. It means seeing me, not just assuming I'll always be there in the background." She nodded slowly, as if she were actually letting the words sink in. "Okay." A beat of silence. Then she hesitated before saying, "We're having another dinner next month. Just family. No fancy setups, no expectations. Just dinner. And I'd like you to be there." I studied her carefully, looking for any signs of manipulation, of hidden motives. But there were none. Just a mother who was finally trying. Even if it was years too late. I exhaled, feeling the weight of years of resentment start to lift just a little. "I'll think about it?" She nodded, accepting that it was the best answer she was going to get. I didn't stay much longer after that. There were still things left unsaid, still wounds that needed time to heal. But as I walked out of that house, I felt something shift. For the first time, I wasn't just playing my assigned role. I was setting the terms. And they were finally learning that they had to meet me halfway. That night, as I sat on my apartment balcony with a glass of wine, my phone buzzed again. A message from Ethan. "Ethan, so, you won." Mom's been weirdly quiet all day. I rolled my eyes, but a small smile played at my lips. Me, it was never about winning, Ethan. He took a few minutes before responding. "Ethan, yeah, well, you still kinda did." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I looked out over the city, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. For years, I had bent over backward to be what my family needed, and for years they had taken it for granted. But now, things were different. I was different. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what that meant. So after years of being their last priority, I finally put myself first. And guess what? It hit them harder than they ever expected. But here's the question. Was it too late? Did my family finally learn their lesson, or was this just another wake-up call they'd ignore? What would you have done in my place? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you've ever felt unappreciated in your own life, hit that like button, because, trust me, you're not alone. People will take as much as you give until you decide you've had enough. I spent years sacrificing my time, my energy, my happiness, all because I thought it was my role. But here's the truth. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's survival. In America, we pride ourselves on independence, yet too many of us let guilt keep us trapped in thankless roles. If they only value you when you're useful, step back. Let them feel your absence. Respect isn't given to those who stay silent, it's earned by those who demand it. Know your worth, because if you don't, no one else will.